The Wendigo's curse. The dense forests of northern Canada have always been a place of mystery and legend. For generations, the indigenous Cree people have spoken of the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that roams the woods, preying on the unwary. The Wendigo is said to be a creature of insatiable hunger, a gaunt figure with glowing eyes and a heart of ice. It is a tale that has been passed down through the ages, a warning to those who venture too far into the wilderness. In the small village of Pine Creek, nestled deep within these ancient woods, the legend of the Wendigo was more than just a story. It was a living nightmare. Over the past few months, a series of gruesome attacks had left the villagers in a state of constant fear. Livestock had been found mutilated, and several villagers had gone missing, their bodies never recovered. The locals were convinced that the Wendigo had returned, and they were desperate for help. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, had been called in to investigate the reports, but their efforts had been in vain. The dense forest and harsh winter conditions made it nearly impossible to track the creature, and the officers found themselves at a loss. The villagers, frustrated and terrified, turned to their own for protection. Every night, a group of local hunters patrolled the woods, armed with rifles and guided by the light of the moon. Among them was Thomas Blackwood, a seasoned hunter with a deep respect for the land and its legends. Thomas had grown up hearing stories of the Wendigo from his grandfather, and he knew that the creature was not to be taken lightly. One cold, moonlit night, as the hunters gathered around a campfire, Thomas spoke to the group. "We need to be vigilant," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "The Wendigo is a cunning predator. It knows these woods better than any of us. We must stay together and watch each other's backs." The hunters nodded in agreement, their faces grim. They knew the risks, but they also knew that they had no choice. Their families depended on them. As the night wore on, the hunters spread out, each taking a different path through the forest. Thomas moved silently through the trees, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and the distant howl of a wolf. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, sending a chill down Thomas's spine. He sprinted towards the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached a small clearing, he saw one of the hunters, Jacob, lying on the ground, his body torn and bloodied. Thomas knelt beside his fallen friend, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the attacker. He knew that the Wendigo was near, and he could feel its malevolent presence. He raised his rifle, ready to defend himself, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. The other hunters arrived moments later, their faces pale with fear. They looked at Jacob's lifeless body, and then at Thomas, their eyes filled with questions. "It was the Wendigo," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get back to the village and warn the others." The hunters carried Jacob's body back to Pine Creek, their hearts heavy with grief. As they entered the village, the residents gathered around, their faces etched with worry. "We need to fortify the village," Thomas said, addressing the crowd. "The Wendigo is out there, and it won't stop until it has claimed more lives. We must work together to protect our families." The villagers set to work, reinforcing their homes and setting up watchtowers around the perimeter. They knew that the Wendigo was a formidable foe, but they were determined to stand their ground. As the days turned into weeks, the attacks continued. Livestock were found slaughtered, and more villagers went missing. The hunters patrolled the woods every night, but the Wendigo remained elusive, always one step ahead. One evening, as Thomas sat by the fire, his mind racing with thoughts of the creature, an old man approached him. It was Chief Grey Wolf, the village elder and a respected shaman. He had lived through many winters and had seen the Wendigo's wrath before. "Thomas," Grey Wolf said, his voice low and filled with wisdom, "the Wendigo is not just a creature of flesh and bone. It is a spirit of hunger and despair, born from the darkest corners of the human soul. To defeat it, you must understand its nature." Thomas listened intently, his eyes fixed on the old man. "How can we stop it?" he asked, desperation in his voice. Grey Wolf took a deep breath and continued. "The Wendigo feeds on fear and isolation. It preys on those who are lost and alone. To defeat it, you must confront it with courage and unity. You must face it together, as a community. The next morning, Thomas gathered the villagers and shared Grey Wolf's words. They decided to hold a ceremony, a ritual to cleanse the village of the Wendigo's curse. The shaman led the way, chanting ancient prayers and burning sacred herbs to drive away the malevolent spirit. As the sun set, the villagers gathered in the center of Pine Creek, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames of the bonfire. They held hands and sang songs of hope and resilience, their voices rising above the howling wind. Thomas stood at the edge of the circle, his rifle at the ready. He knew that the Wendigo would not be easily banished, but he also knew that they had to try. As the night wore on, the villagers' voices grew stronger, their unity a beacon of light in the darkness. Suddenly, a chilling roar echoed through the forest, and the Wendigo emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with malevolent fury. The villagers gasped in fear, but Thomas stepped forward, his heart filled with determination. "Stand together!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the din. "We can defeat it if we face it as one." The villagers tightened their grip on each other's hands, their fear giving way to resolve. The Wendigo lunged towards them, but Thomas fired his rifle, the shot ringing out like a thunderclap. The creature staggered, its eyes filled with rage and pain. Grey Wolf stepped forward, his voice rising in a powerful chant. The villagers joined in, their voices merging into a harmonious chorus. The Wendigo howled in agony, its form flickering and fading as the power of their unity overwhelmed it. With one final, ear-piercing scream, the Wendigo dissolved into the night, its malevolent presence banished from the village. The villagers stood in stunned silence, their hearts pounding with relief and triumph. Thomas lowered his rifle, his hands trembling. He turned to Grey Wolf, who nodded in approval. "You have done well, Thomas," the shaman said. "The Wendigo is gone, but we must remain vigilant. Its spirit may return if we allow fear and despair to take hold once more." The villagers spent the next few days repairing the damage and mourning the loss of those who had fallen. They knew that the Wendigo's curse had been lifted, but they also understood the importance of staying united and strong. As the seasons changed and the snow began to melt, Pine Creek slowly returned to normal. The villagers continued to honor the memory of those who had been lost, and they remained vigilant, always ready to protect their home from any threat. Thomas and the other hunters continued to patrol the woods, but now they did so with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew that the Wendigo had been defeated, but they also knew that the forest held many other dangers. One evening, as Thomas sat by the fire, Grey Wolf approached him once more. "You have shown great courage and leadership," the shaman said. "The village is safe because of you." Thomas nodded, his heart filled with gratitude. "We did it together," he replied. "The strength of our community is what saved us." Grey Wolf smiled, his eyes twinkling with wisdom. "Remember that, Thomas. As long as we stand together, we can face any challenge." The two men sat in companionable silence, the fire casting a warm glow over the village. The legend of the Wendigo would live on, but it would now be a story of triumph and resilience, a reminder of the power of unity and the strength of the human spirit. And so, the village of Pine Creek thrived, its people bound together by the trials they had faced and the victories they had won. The Wendigo's curse had been lifted, and the forest once again became a place of beauty and wonder, a testament to the enduring bond between man and nature. Part 2. 20 years had passed since the village of Pine Creek had banished the Wendigo. The tale of their triumph had become legend, passed down to a new generation. Thomas Blackwood, now in his 50s, had become the village elder, respected for his wisdom and courage. The scars of that terrible winter had faded, but the lessons learned remained etched in the community's collective memory. Life in Pine Creek had flourished. The village had grown, welcoming new families and expanding its borders. But with prosperity came complacency, and the younger generation viewed the Wendigo story as just that, a story. Among them was Sarah, Thomas's daughter. At 18, she was headstrong and skeptical, chafing against the old ways and the constant vigilance her father preached. "Dad," she would say, rolling her eyes, It's been 2 decades. Nothing's out there but deer and the occasional bear. Thomas would shake his head, his eyes clouded with worry. The Wendigo isn't just a creature, Sarah. It's a spirit, a curse. And curses can lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. But Sarah, like many of her peers, remained unconvinced. The nightly patrols had become more of a social gathering than a serious endeavor, and the old rituals were performed with less fervor each passing year. As autumn painted the forest in hues of red and gold, a new family arrived in Pine Creek. The Johnsons, city folk looking for a quieter life, settled into a cabin on the outskirts of town. Their son, Michael, quickly became the talk of the village. Handsome and charming, he caught Sarah's eye, much to Thomas's dismay. "There's something off about that boy," Thomas confided to his old friend Grey Wolf, now well into his 90s but still sharp as ever. Grey Wolf nodded slowly. "The spirits are restless. Change is coming, Thomas. We must be prepared." As winter approached, a series of strange occurrences began to plague Pine Creek. Livestock went missing, their pens found empty with no signs of forced entry. Eerie howls echoed through the night, sending chills down the spines of even the most skeptical villagers. Thomas called for increased patrols and a renewal of the old protective rituals, but many, including Sarah, dismissed his concerns as paranoia. "It's probably just wolves," she argued. "We don't need to panic over every little thing." But as the first snow fell, the situation escalated. A young hunter failed to return from a routine patrol. Search parties found only his rifle, abandoned in a clearing, the snow around it stained with blood. Fear gripped the village once more. The older generation recognized the signs, their memories of the Wendigo's terror flooding back. But the younger villagers, while shaken, remained skeptical of supernatural explanations. Sarah, torn between her father's warnings and her own disbelief, found solace in Michael's company. The two began spending more time together, often wandering the forest's edge despite Thomas's objections. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in deep purples, Sarah and Michael ventured further into the woods than usual. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence fell over the forest. "We should head back," Sarah said, a note of unease in her voice. Michael smiled, his eyes glinting strangely in the fading light. "Afraid of the big bad Wendigo?" he teased. Before Sarah could respond, a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence. It came from the direction of the village. Without a word they ran, fear lending speed to their feet. As they burst from the tree-line, a horrifying sight greeted them. The village was in chaos. People ran in panic as a monstrous figure loped between the buildings, its emaciated form a mockery of the human shape. The Wendigo had returned. Sarah froze, her disbelief crumbling in the face of the nightmare before her. She turned to Michael, only to find him gone. In his place stood a second Wendigo, its eyes burning with hunger as it gazed at her. "Michael?" she whispered, her voice choked with terror. The creature that had been Michael let out a chilling laugh. "Foolish girl," it hissed. "Your village's complacency has given us strength. The curse never left. It merely waited, growing stronger with each passing year." Sarah ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She found her father organizing a group of hunters, their faces grim with determination. "Dad," she gasped, "you were right. It's back. And Michael is one of them." Thomas's face hardened. "We knew this day might come," he said. "But we're not unprepared. Grey Wolf." The ancient shaman stepped forward, his frail body belying the power in his eyes. "The rituals," he said. "We must perform them again, but stronger this time. The entire village must participate." As the Wendigos rampaged through Pine Creek, the villagers rallied. Those who could fight formed a defensive perimeter, while others began the preparations for the ritual. Sarah, her skepticism shattered, threw herself into the efforts, determined to make amends for her disbelief. The battle raged through the night. The hunters, led by Thomas, fought with desperate courage, their weapons blessed by Grey Wolf's ancient magic. But the Wendigos were powerful, their hunger lending them inhuman strength. As dawn approached, The villagers gathered in the town square, forming a circle around a great bonfire. Grey Wolf began the chant, his voice cracking with age but filled with power. The villagers joined in, their voices rising in a chorus of defiance against the darkness. Sarah stood beside her father, her hand clasped in his. As the chant grew stronger, the Wendigos converged on the square, drawn by the power of the ritual. They howled in rage and pain as the unified will of the village pushed them back. In a final, desperate lunge, the Wendigo that had been Michael leaped towards Sarah. Thomas stepped in front of his daughter, his rifle raised. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the mountains. The Wendigo fell, its form dissolving into mist as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. The second Wendigo, faced with the combined power of the ritual and the dawn, let out a final, chilling scream before it too faded away. Silence fell over Pine Creek. The villagers stood in stunned disbelief, the realization of their victory slowly sinking in. Sarah collapsed into her father's arms, sobbing with relief and grief. In the days that followed, Pine Creek began the process of rebuilding and healing. The losses were mourned, the damage repaired. But more importantly, the village had rediscovered its unity and purpose. Sarah, forever changed by the experience, took up her father's mantle as a protector of the village. She worked to bridge the gap between the older and younger generations, ensuring that the knowledge and vigilance that had saved them would never again be forgotten. As winter gave way to spring, Thomas and Sarah stood at the edge of the forest, looking out over the reborn village. "The Wendigo may return one day," Thomas said softly. Sarah nodded, her eyes clear and determined. "And we'll be ready," she replied. "All of us together." Thomas smiled, pride and love shining in his eyes. As they turned back towards Pine Creek, the forest behind them stirred with the promise of new life, and the eternal vigilance of a community united against the darkness. The awakening in the woods. Deep in the remote forests of northern Canada, where ancient pines towered and shadows lingered even in daylight, three figures moved silently through the underbrush. They were sisters Morrigan, Branwen, and Ceridwen, witches who had fled persecution in the old world centuries ago, finding refuge in this vast wilderness. Tonight was special. The full moon hung low and bloated in the sky, bathing the forest in an eerie silver glow. It was the night they had waited decades for, when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. "Here," Morrigan whispered, coming to a stop beside an old, gnarled oak. "This is the place." Her sisters gathered around as she knelt, brushing away centuries of fallen leaves to reveal a crude headstone, its inscription long since worn away by time and the elements. But the witches knew what lay beneath the remains of a Wendigo, a cursed creature of insatiable hunger that had terrorized these lands long ago. "Are you certain about this, sister?" Branwen asked, a note of hesitation in her voice. "The Wendigo's curse is not to be trifled with." Morrigan's eyes glinted in the moonlight. "We've prepared for this moment for lifetimes. With the Wendigo's power, we'll finally have our revenge on those who drove us from our homes." Ceridwen nodded in agreement. "The world has forgotten the old ways, forgotten to fear the dark. It's time they were reminded." Without further discussion, the sisters began their work. They dug into the earth with enchanted tools, careful not to disturb the bones that lay within. As the moon reached its zenith, they finally unearthed a complete skeleton, its bones stained dark with age. Morrigan reverently lifted the skull, its empty eye sockets seeming to stare accusingly at the witches. "Now," she said, "we begin." The sisters formed a circle around the remains, joining hands. They began to chant in an ancient tongue, their voices rising and falling in eerie harmony. The very air seemed to thicken as their spell took hold, tendrils of dark energy swirling around the bones. Slowly, impossibly, flesh began to knit itself over the skeleton. Muscles formed, sinews stretched, and skin grew to cover it all. The body twitched and jerked as the Wendigo was pulled back from the realm of death. With a gasping roar, the creature's eyes snapped open, glowing orbs of hunger in a gaunt, horrifying face. It sat up, its movements jerky and unnatural, and fixed its gaze on the three witches. "Rise, great Wendigo," Morrigan intoned. "We have awakened you from your long slumber to dash." Her words were cut short as the Wendigo lunged forward with inhuman speed, its jaws clamping down on her throat. Morrigan's scream turned to a gurgle as the creature tore into her flesh, devouring her with ravenous abandon. Branwen and Ceridwen stumbled back in horror, their carefully laid plans crumbling before their eyes. The Wendigo paid them no mind, focused entirely on its grisly feast. When it had finished with Morrigan, it turned its attention to her sisters, its eyes burning with an insatiable hunger. The two remaining witches fled into the night, their screams echoing through the forest. But they were no match for the Wendigo's speed and savagery. One by one, they fell to its relentless pursuit, their bodies torn apart and devoured. As dawn broke over the forest, the Wendigo stood alone in the clearing, blood dripping from its maw. The witch's spell had indeed resurrected it, but they had failed to bind it to their will. Now it was free, a nightmare-given flesh, driven by an all-consuming need to feed. The creature tilted its head, catching the scent of humans on the wind. With a low growl, it loped off into the forest, drawn inexorably towards the nearest settlement. In the small town of Pine Creek, life continued as it always had. Loggers headed out to the forests, shopkeepers opened their doors, and children made their way to school. None of them knew of the horror that had awakened in the woods, or the fate that awaited them. Tom Hawkins, the local sheriff, was enjoying his morning coffee when the call came in. Sarah Jensen, who ran the general store on the outskirts of town, was hysterical on the other end of the line. "Tom, you've got to come quick," she sobbed. There's something out here. It killed Bill." Tom tried to calm her down, to get more information, but Sarah's words dissolved into incoherent screaming before the line went dead. With a sinking feeling in his gut, Tom grabbed his gun and headed out to investigate. When he arrived at the general store, the scene that greeted him was like something out of a nightmare. The front of the building had been torn apart, as if by some enormous beast. Blood stained the splintered wood and broken glass. "Sarah?" Tom called out, his hand on his holster as he cautiously approached. "Sarah, are you there?" A low, inhuman growl was his only answer. Tom whirled around to see a figure emerge from the shadows of the ruined store. It was vaguely human in shape, but its proportions were all wrong, too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down to its knees. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over protruding bones, and its eyes glowed with an unholy hunger. Tom's training took over, and he drew his gun in one smooth motion. "Freeze!" he shouted, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "Don't move!" The creature Tom's mind shied away from calling it a person cocked its head at him. Then, with a speed that defied belief, it charged. Tom emptied his clip into the monster, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. It slammed into him with the force of a truck, sending him flying. As Tom struggled to his feet, dazed and winded, he saw the creature hunched over something on the ground. With horror, he realized it was feeding on Sarah's body. The sound of tearing flesh and crunching bone filled the air. Fighting down the urge to vomit, Tom stumbled to his cruiser and grabbed the shotgun from the trunk. He pumped a shell into the chamber and took aim at the monster's head. The blast echoed through the quiet morning, and the creature's head exploded in a shower of gore. Its body twitched and fell still. Tom approached cautiously, shotgun at the ready, but the thing appeared to be dead. He radioed for backup, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what had happened. Within the hour, the town was swarming with police and emergency services. The bodies of Sarah and Bill were taken away, and the area was cordoned off as a crime scene. But even as the initial shock began to wear off, reports started coming in from all over town. People were going missing, homes were found torn apart, and strange, inhuman screams echoed through the night. The Wendigo, it seemed, had not been destroyed. It had merely been delayed, its cursed flesh knitting itself back together even as Tom had called for help. And now it was loose in the town, feeding indiscriminately, its hunger growing with every life it took. As night fell, Pine Creek had become a war zone. The local police, reinforced by state troopers and even a unit of the National Guard, patrolled the streets in armored vehicles. Civilians huddled in their homes, doors barricaded and guns at the ready. Tom Hawkins found himself at the center of it all, coordinating the defense of the town he'd sworn to protect. But against an enemy like this, unkillable, insatiable, what hope did they really have? "Sheriff," a young deputy called out, his face pale with fear. "We've got reports of multiple sightings in the east end of town. It's like there's more than one of them now." Tom's blood ran cold. He remembered the creature feeding on Sarah's body on Bill's. It wasn't just killing to satisfy its hunger, it was creating more of its kind. "God help us," he muttered. Then, louder, "All units converge on the east end. We need to contain this before it spreads any further." As the night wore on, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The Wendigos, for there were indeed multiple creatures, now seemed to be everywhere at once, striking from the shadows and disappearing before they could be engaged. Gunfire and screams filled the air, punctuated by the inhuman howls of the monsters. In the chaos, Tom found himself separated from the main force, cornered in an alley by one of the creatures. It advanced on him slowly, savoring his fear, its glowing eyes fixed on him with terrible hunger. Just as it was about to pounce, a figure stepped out of the shadows behind it. An old woman, her face lined with age and wisdom, raised her hands and began to chant in a language Tom didn't recognize. The Wendigo whirled to face this new threat, but it was too late. The old woman's spell took hold, and the creature began to writhe in agony. Before Tom's astonished eyes, it crumbled to dust, leaving nothing behind but a foul-smelling wind. "Who? What?" Tom stammered, struggling to process what he'd just seen. The old woman gave him a grim smile. "My name is Ilara. I'm what you might call a witch, one of the good ones. And I'm here to clean up the mess my sisters made." Over the next few hours, Ilara worked tirelessly, using her magic to track down and destroy the Wendigos one by one. Tom and his men provided support, corralling the creatures and keeping them distracted while Ilara worked her spells. As dawn broke over Pine Creek, the last of the Wendigos fell. The town was in ruins, its population decimated, but the nightmare was finally over. In the aftermath, as the survivors began the long process of rebuilding, Tom sought out Ilara. He found her standing at the edge of the forest, gazing out at the trees with a troubled expression. "Thank you," he said simply. "We couldn't have survived without your help." Ilara nodded, her eyes never leaving the forest. "It was the least I could do, considering it was my kind that unleashed this horror upon you." "Your sisters?" Tom asked, remembering what she'd said earlier. "Yes," Ilara sighed. "Morrigan, Branwen, and Ceridwen. We came to this land centuries ago, fleeing persecution in the old world. But while I sought to live in harmony with nature, they nursed their grudges, plotting revenge against humanity." She turned to face Tom, her eyes filled with sorrow and determination. "The Wendigo they awakened has been destroyed, but the evil that created it still lingers. I fear this may only be the beginning." Tom felt a chill run down his spine at her words. He looked out at the forest, suddenly aware of the ancient, unknowable forces that lurked in its depths. "What can we do?" he asked. Ilara placed a hand on his shoulder. "Be vigilant. Remember the old ways, the old warnings. And if you ever need me..." She pressed a small, smooth stone into his hand. "This will guide you to me." With that, she turned and walked into the forest, disappearing among the trees as if she had never been there at all. Tom stood there for a long moment, the weight of all that had happened settling over him. Then, pocketing the stone, he turned back to his town. There was work to be done, people to protect. And now, he knew, there were darker things in the world than he had ever imagined, things that might one day return to threaten everything he held dear. But when that day came, he would be ready. They all would. Part 2. 5 years had passed since the Wendigos rampaged through Pine Creek. The town had rebuilt, its population slowly recovering as new families moved in, drawn by promises of cheap land and a fresh start. But for those who had lived through that terrible night, the scars ran deep. Sheriff Tom Hawkins kept the smooth stone Ilara had given him in his pocket at all times, a constant reminder of the supernatural threat that had nearly destroyed his town. He'd hoped never to use it, but as autumn leaves began to fall and an unseasonable chill crept into the air, a familiar dread settled in his gut. It started with whispers. Hikers reported strange noises in the forest, animalistic yet somehow wrong. Hunters found game carcasses stripped clean with unnatural precision. And on the outskirts of town, pets began to disappear. Tom knew he couldn't wait. One crisp morning, he drove to the forest's edge, the stone clutched in his hand. As he approached the tree-line, it began to warm, pulsing with an inner light. Tom took a deep breath and stepped into the woods. He walked for what seemed like hours, the stone guiding him deeper into the wilderness. Finally, he emerged into a small clearing where Alara stood waiting, looking as if she hadn't aged a day. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, her eyes grave. "You've felt it too, haven't you? The stirring in the woods." Tom nodded. Is it back? The Wendigo?" Alara shook her head. "Not exactly. But the evil my sisters unleashed didn't die with those creatures. It's been growing, feeding on the fear and trauma left in their wake. And now, I'm afraid, it's found new hosts." She explained that a group of teenagers, fascinated by the Wendigo legend, had been performing rituals in the woods, trying to tap into its power. They didn't understand the forces they were dealing with, and their actions had opened a door that should have remained closed. "We need to stop them," Tom said, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. Alara placed a hand on his arm. "Violence won't solve this, Sheriff. These are children, misguided but not evil. We need to break the curse's hold on them before it's too late." Together, they set out to find the teenagers. As night fell, they came upon a makeshift altar deep in the woods. 5 young people stood around it, chanting in a language that made Tom's skin crawl. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their bodies were beginning to twist and elongate. "Stop!" Alara cried out, her voice carrying a power that made the trees themselves seem to bend away. "You don't know what you're doing!" The teenagers turned as one, snarling. The transformation was already beginning. Their teeth had sharpened to points, and their fingers had lengthened into claws. They lunged at Tom and Alara with inhuman speed. What followed was a chaotic battle of magic and willpower. Alara worked to contain the cursed teenagers with barriers of light, while Tom tried to reach through to them, calling out their names, reminding them of their families and their lives before this madness. For a moment, it seemed hopeless. The curse was too strong, the Wendigo's hunger too deeply rooted. But then, as dawn began to break, a change came over the youngest of the group. Recognition flickered in her eyes, and she began to fight against the transformation. "Sarah!" Tom called out, recognizing the girl. "That's it, fight it! Remember who you are!" Sarah's resistance seemed to weaken the curse's hold on the others. One by one, they began to come back to themselves, the monstrous features receding. Alara seized the moment, channeling her power into a spell that shattered the curse's grip on the teenagers. As the sun rose, 5 exhausted, terrified, but fully human teenagers huddled together in the clearing. Tom and Alara worked quickly to destroy the altar and cleanse the area of the lingering dark energy. In the days that followed, Tom and Alara worked with the teenagers and their families to help them recover from the ordeal. The young people were haunted by what they'd almost become, but with support and guidance, they began to heal. Alara took on the role of teacher, instructing not just the 5 teenagers but anyone in town who was interested in learning about the true nature of magic and the responsibility that came with it. She taught them protective spells and rituals to ward off evil, ensuring that Pine Creek would be better prepared for any future supernatural threats. As for Tom, he found his worldview forever changed. He couldn't go back to seeing the world as he had before, but he could use his new understanding to better protect his town. He worked closely with Alara to set up a network of magical early warning systems throughout the forest. The Wendigo's legacy lived on, not as a curse, but as a cautionary tale. Pine Creek became known as a haven for those seeking to understand and responsibly practice magic. People came from far and wide to learn from Alara and to see the town that had twice faced down unimaginable horrors. Years passed, and Pine Creek flourished. The forest, once a place of terror, became a sanctuary. The boundary between the magical and mundane worlds blurred, with everyday life in the town taking on a hint of the extraordinary. Tom, now gray-haired but still sharp, often found himself recounting the story of the Wendigo and the brave witch who had saved them all to wide-eyed children around campfires. He would finish by holding up the smooth stone Alara had given him, its soft glow a reminder of the magic that now openly flowed through Pine Creek. "Remember," he would say, "respect the old ways, but don't fear them. Learn, understand, and above all, be kind. For in kindness and understanding, we find the strongest magic of all." And in the forest, watching over the town she had come to call home, Alara smiled. The Wendigo's curse had been broken, its legacy transformed. In its place, a new tradition of wisdom, respect, and harmony with the natural world had taken root. As she gazed at the thriving community below, Alara knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, Pine Creek would face them together, stronger than ever before. The Wendigo among us. The small town of Pine Creek, nestled in the dense forests of northern Canada, had always been a quiet place. The townsfolk knew each other by name, and the biggest excitement usually came from the annual Lumberjack Festival. But recently, a dark cloud had settled over the community. Unsolved murders and disappearances had become disturbingly frequent, and whispers of a malevolent presence began to circulate. Sheriff Tom Hawkins, a seasoned lawman with a deep love for his town, was at his wits' end. The bodies that had been found were mutilated beyond recognition, and the scenes of the crimes were always eerily similar: no signs of struggle, no footprints, and no clues. The only common thread was the look of sheer terror frozen on the victims' faces. One evening, as Tom sat in his office, poring over the latest case files, his deputy, Sarah Jensen, knocked on the door. "Sheriff, you need to see this," she said, her voice trembling. Tom followed her to the evidence room, where she handed him a photograph. It was a grainy image taken from a security camera outside the local diner. In the background, barely visible, was a tall, gaunt figure with glowing eyes. "Is this?" Tom began, but Sarah cut him off. "Yes, Sheriff. It's the same figure that's been spotted near every crime scene. I think we might be dealing with something not human." Tom's mind raced. He had heard the old legends of the Wendigo, a creature of insatiable hunger that could take on human form. But those were just stories, weren't they? "We need to find out more," Tom said, his voice steady. "Let's talk to Grey Wolf." Grey Wolf was the town's elder and a respected shaman. He had lived through many winters and had a deep understanding of the old ways. If anyone could shed light on this mystery, it was him. As they approached Grey Wolf's cabin, the air grew colder, and an unnatural silence settled over the forest. Grey Wolf greeted them at the door, his eyes filled with a knowing sadness. "I've been expecting you," he said, leading them inside. "The Wendigo has returned." Tom and Sarah listened intently as Grey Wolf recounted the legend. The Wendigo was a spirit of hunger and despair, capable of taking on human form to blend in with its prey. It fed on fear and flesh, leaving a trail of death and terror in its wake. "But how do we stop it?" Tom asked, his frustration evident. Grey Wolf sighed. "The Wendigo is cunning and powerful. It can only be defeated by confronting it with courage and unity. You must find its human form and expose it for what it truly is." Tom and Sarah left the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew they had to act quickly before more lives were lost. They decided to start by interviewing the townsfolk, hoping to find any clues that might lead them to the Wendigo's human guise. As they spoke to the residents, a pattern began to emerge. The victims had all been seen in the company of a newcomer to Pine Creek, a man named Victor Blackwood. Victor had arrived in town a few months earlier, claiming to be a writer seeking inspiration in the quiet wilderness. He had quickly ingratiated himself with the locals, but something about him had always seemed off. Tom and Sarah decided to pay Victor a visit. They found him at the local library, poring over old books on folklore and mythology. He greeted them with a warm smile, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Victor, we need to ask you a few questions," Tom said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Of course, Sheriff," Victor replied, his eyes glinting with curiosity. "What can I do for you?" Tom and Sarah began to question Victor about his whereabouts on the nights of the murders. He answered smoothly, providing alibis that seemed plausible. But as the conversation continued, Tom noticed a flicker of something dark in Victor's eyes. "One more thing," Tom said, his voice steady. "Do you know anything about the Wendigo?" Victor's smile faltered for a moment, and his eyes narrowed. "The Wendigo? Just an old legend, isn't it?" Tom leaned in, his gaze unwavering. "Legends often have a basis in reality. And we've been seeing things that suggest the Wendigo might be more than just a story." Victor's expression hardened, and for a brief moment, Tom saw a flash of something monstrous in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by the charming facade. "I assure you, Sheriff, I have no knowledge of any Wendigo," Victor said smoothly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Tom and Sarah left the library, their suspicions confirmed. They knew they had to act quickly, but they needed proof. They decided to keep Victor under surveillance, hoping to catch him in the act. That night, Tom and Sarah took turns watching Victor's cabin from a hidden vantage point. The hours dragged on, and just as Tom was beginning to doubt their plan, he saw movement. Victor emerged from the cabin, his form shifting and elongating as he stepped into the moonlight. His eyes glowed with an unholy light, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he signaled to Sarah. They followed Victor at a safe distance, watching as he moved through the forest with unnatural speed and grace. He led them to a clearing where a group of townsfolk had gathered, drawn by some unseen force. Victor began to chant in a guttural language, his voice resonating with dark power. The townsfolk stood in a trance, their eyes vacant and their bodies swaying to the rhythm of his words. Tom knew they had to act. He and Sarah stepped into the clearing, their guns drawn. "Victor Blackwood, you're under arrest!" Tom shouted. Victor turned to face them, his eyes burning with rage. "Fools!" he hissed. "You cannot stop me. I am the Wendigo, and I will feast on your flesh." With a roar, Victor lunged at them, his form shifting into the monstrous visage of the Wendigo. Tom and Sarah fired their guns, but the bullets seemed to have little effect. The creature's claws slashed through the air, narrowly missing them as they dodged and weaved. Desperation fueled their movements as they fought to stay alive. Tom remembered Grey Wolf's words, courage and unity. He glanced at Sarah, and she nodded, understanding his unspoken plan. Together, they charged at the Wendigo, their combined strength and determination driving them forward. They tackled the creature to the ground, pinning it with all their might. The Wendigo thrashed and howled, but Tom and Sarah held firm. "Now, Sarah!" Tom shouted. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small vial of blessed water that Grey Wolf had given them. She splashed it onto the Wendigo's face, and the creature screamed in agony. Its form began to waver and dissolve, the dark energy that sustained it dissipating into the night. With one final, ear-piercing scream, the Wendigo disintegrated, leaving behind only the lifeless body of Victor Blackwood. The trance that held the townsfolk was broken, and they collapsed to the ground, dazed and confused. Tom and Sarah stood over Victor's body, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They had done it. The Wendigo was defeated. In the days that followed, Pine Creek began to heal. The murders and disappearances stopped, and the townsfolk slowly returned to their normal lives. Tom and Sarah were hailed as heroes, but they knew that the true credit belonged to Grey Wolf and the ancient wisdom he had shared. As the first snow of winter began to fall, Tom visited Grey Wolf's cabin to thank him. The old shaman smiled, his eyes twinkling with pride. "You have done well, Sheriff," Grey Wolf said. "But remember, the Wendigo is a spirit of hunger and despair. It can always return if we allow fear and darkness to take hold." Tom nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "We'll be ready," he said. "We'll protect our town, no matter what." And so, Pine Creek remained vigilant, its people united by the trials they had faced and the victories they had won. The legend of the Wendigo would live on, but it would now be a story of courage and resilience, a reminder of the strength that could be found in unity and the light that could banish even the darkest of shadows. Part 2. The town of Pine Creek had found a fragile peace after the defeat of the Wendigo. Sheriff Tom Hawkins and his deputy, Sarah Jensen, had become local legends, their bravery and determination celebrated in the community. But the memory of the Wendigo's terror still lingered, a dark shadow that refused to fully dissipate. As winter settled over the town, bringing with it a blanket of snow and a biting chill, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The forest seemed quieter than usual, and the animals were behaving strangely, as if sensing an unseen threat. One evening, as Tom sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports, Sarah burst in, her face pale with worry. "Tom, you need to see this," she said, handing him a letter. "It was left on my doorstep this morning." Tom unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. It was a warning, written in a shaky hand, claiming that the Wendigo's spirit had not been fully vanquished. The letter spoke of a dark force that had taken root in the forest, feeding on the fear and despair left in the Wendigo's wake. "We need to talk to Grey Wolf," Tom said, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at his gut. They made their way to Grey Wolf's cabin, the snow crunching underfoot. The old shaman greeted them at the door, his eyes filled with a knowing sadness. "I feared this might happen," Grey Wolf said, leading them inside. "The Wendigo's spirit is resilient. It can linger in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike." Tom and Sarah listened intently as Grey Wolf explained that the Wendigo's curse was not just a physical manifestation, but a spiritual one. The dark energy that had fueled the creature could still influence the living, corrupting their minds and hearts. "We must perform a cleansing ritual," Grey Wolf said, "but it will require the participation of the entire town. We need to unite our spirits to banish the darkness once and for all." Tom and Sarah knew that convincing the townsfolk to participate in such a ritual would be no easy task. Many were still skeptical of the supernatural, and the memory of the Wendigo's terror was a wound that had only just begun to heal. They decided to call a town meeting, hoping to rally the community. As the townsfolk gathered in the community center, Tom and Sarah stood before them, their faces serious. "We have reason to believe that the Wendigo's spirit still lingers in the forest," Tom began. "Grey Wolf has explained that we need to perform a cleansing ritual to banish it for good. We need your help." Murmurs of disbelief and fear rippled through the crowd. Some scoffed at the idea, while others looked genuinely frightened. "Please," Sarah said, her voice earnest. "We know this is hard to believe, but we've seen what the Wendigo can do. We can't let it take root again." Grey Wolf stepped forward, his presence commanding respect. "The Wendigo feeds on fear and despair. We must stand together, united in our resolve, to cleanse our home of its dark influence." Slowly, the townsfolk began to nod in agreement. They had seen the horrors the Wendigo had wrought, and they trusted Tom, Sarah, and Grey Wolf. One by one, they pledged their support. The ritual was set for the next full moon, a time when the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was at its thinnest. The townsfolk gathered in the clearing where the Wendigo had been defeated, forming a circle around a great bonfire. Grey Wolf led the ritual, chanting ancient prayers and burning sacred herbs to drive away the dark energy. The townsfolk joined in, their voices rising in a harmonious chorus that echoed through the forest. As the ritual reached its climax, a chilling wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the bonfire. The darkness seemed to press in on them, and the air grew heavy with malevolence. Tom and Sarah stood at the center of the circle, their hands clasped tightly. They could feel the Wendigo's presence, a cold, hungry force that sought to consume them. "Stay strong," Grey Wolf called out. "Do not let fear take hold." The townsfolk redoubled their efforts, their voices growing louder and more determined. The darkness wavered, and for a moment, it seemed as if the Wendigo's spirit might be banished. But then, a figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It was Victor Blackwood, the man who had been the Wendigo's human guise. His form was twisted and gaunt, a mockery of the man he had once been. "You cannot defeat me," Victor hissed, his voice a chilling echo. "I am eternal. I am hunger. I am despair." Tom stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "You're wrong, Victor. We defeated you once, and we'll do it again." With a roar, Victor lunged at Tom, his claws slashing through the air. Tom dodged, but the force of the attack sent him sprawling to the ground. Sarah rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. "We have to finish the ritual," she said, her voice filled with determination. Grey Wolf continued to chant, his voice unwavering despite the chaos. The townsfolk joined in, their voices merging into a powerful, unified force. Tom and Sarah stood together, their hands raised in defiance. "We will not let you take our home," Tom shouted. "We will not let you feed on our fear." The air crackled with energy as the ritual reached its peak. The darkness around Victor began to waver, and he let out a scream of rage and pain. With one final, powerful chant, Grey Wolf completed the ritual. A blinding light erupted from the bonfire, engulfing Victor and the surrounding darkness. The Wendigo's spirit howled in agony as it was torn apart, its malevolent energy dissipating into the night. As the light faded, the clearing was filled with an eerie silence. The townsfolk stood in stunned disbelief, their hearts pounding with relief and triumph. Tom and Sarah looked around, their faces filled with hope. The Wendigo's spirit had been banished, and the darkness that had plagued their town was gone. Grey Wolf approached them, his eyes filled with pride. "You have done well," he said. "The Wendigo's curse has been lifted, and your town is safe." The townsfolk began to cheer, their voices filled with joy and gratitude. They had faced the darkness together and emerged victorious. In the days that followed, Pine Creek began to heal. The memory of the Wendigo's terror slowly faded, replaced by a renewed sense of unity and hope. The townsfolk continued to honor the old ways, performing regular rituals to keep the darkness at bay. Tom and Sarah remained vigilant, knowing that the forest held many other dangers. But they also knew that they had the strength and unity to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the first snow of winter began to fall, Tom stood at the edge of the forest. The smooth stone Alara had given him warm in his hand. He knew that the Wendigo's shadow had been banished, but he also knew that the fight against darkness was never truly over. "We'll be ready," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We'll protect our town, no matter what." And so, Pine Creek thrived, its people bound together by the trials they had faced and the victories they had won. The legend of the Wendigo would live on, but it would now be a story of courage and resilience, a reminder of the strength that could be found in unity and the light that could banish even the darkest of shadows.